Afternoon, colleagues. Thank you very much for taking time to join us in CDTL. Right, we are very honored today to have Professor Michelle Gregg as our guest speaker in CDTL to share with us a very, very important topic, very close to our hearts, and that is evidence-based teaching practice. Right? Michelle is a professor teaching stream in the Department of Computer Science, University of Toronto. She regularly teaches large classes, has written many papers on computing education, and serves on the University of Toronto's President's Teaching Academy and the Association for Computing Machinery, ACM Education Board. Without any further ado, please welcome Professor Michelle Gregg.
Thank you. I was just saying that this is kind of like my teaching assistants meeting because my class has, well, when I was teaching a year ago, I'm on sabbatical now, but when I was teaching a year ago, my class had 2,000 students in the course and 468 of them in the room with me. And when I had the weekly TA meetings, this is about what it looked like. So today, my real goals for today are to help you improve your teaching, and in particular to do that by helping you plan how you can put evidence-based strategies or evidence-based practices into your teaching. But I have a couple of side sort of goals along the way. So I'm going to share bits of my story with you because I'm here, and I think that that's probably why you invited me, is because you wanted to hear a little bit about some story along the way. I also am going to do something a little bit different, which is I'm going to model some teaching techniques. And some of them it'll be old hat for you, but others I'm hoping that you'll see something new. And the first of these is that you'll notice that I have this funny thing going at the bottom of my thing. That's because I'm not lecturing in PowerPoint or Keynote. I'm actually using Notability, which is a slide annotation tool. And so I made PowerPoints and then put the PDF on my iPad so that I can write on them while I'm talking. And I had to do that during COVID because I was teaching a very mathematical oriented course where I would have been writing equations on the board. And so one strategy was to take an iPad and write my equations on the iPad, but I realized I could pre-populate my boards. So instead of like writing down all of what I used to write on the board, I could start with some of it already written, and then I could write other bits and fill it in. And so I'm sort of going to model pre-populated Blackboard for you, except that I mostly pre-populated most of it, so most of it. But that's why we've got the things, and that's why you'll see me. I mean, and then I realized that's kind of hard for giving an actual talk because you don't have any speaker notes anymore. Because when I was doing this with my students, I had 3 big monitors in my house. So I'm kind of going to scramble a little bit, but it's for the purposes of demonstrating this. We're going to discuss some implementation strategies, and I hope to present some ideas at the end to help you share your teaching practices, but the main focus will be to see if we can make a plan for each of you to walk away in some ways with a little bit more plan about how you're going to think about evidence practices in your teaching. So the first thing is to do a Mentimeter poll. So I should have told you need devices, but I guess everybody's got a phone. So if you can go to www.menti.com, and the question is, instead of going around the room and saying, I teach this, I teach this, I teach this, I want a sense of who's here. And so I want you to do this. I want you to write what you teach. So if this were me, I would write computer science. And then in brackets, how many years? There I am. And put that into the poll. And then if I did this right, we'll see they should be starting to show up here. Please let this work.
Sorry, can you show that?
Oh, yeah, they're working. Oh, yeah, the numbers on the top here, it's really tiny. 67, 94, 34, 3. So this is a nice strategy for getting people to introduce themselves in a big group where you don't have to take the time one at a time to do that. I've been going to classes while I've been here at NUS, and I see that lots and lots of people use polling software, so this is not new to you, I'm sure, but this helps us see who's here. Remember, people from computer science. I don't know if I can scroll up. Yeah, there. Okay, so a few people with less than a year, some newbies to teaching, and some really experienced people, 26. I haven't seen Dan put his answer in. He's one of my colleagues. His number should be bigger than mine. Oh, 30 plus, that's probably. Okay, enough of that. Thank you. Let's go back to here. Let's see if we can get to the next slide. Maybe not. So, what are evidence-based teaching practices? Well, here's some thoughts about it. Are they just, this is the way I was taught? Probably not. Are they the way it's always done in my area? What do you think? Thumbs up, thumbs down. Yeah, sometimes, because there's some evidence that that works, because that's the way it was done. And in fact, sometimes people say, I invented this great thing, and the evidence that it's good is that all these people adopted it. But if that were true, then maybe the way it's always done in my area would also be good evidence that it's the right thing. So it's not necessarily, but it's probably not really good evidence, and probably people adopting your stuff isn't actually necessarily the best evidence. How about practices we believe might work in our context? That's not the evidence yet, but those are promising. Those are things we could try and then maybe get evidence. How about practices someone else has been shown to be effective in their context? Yeah, maybe, but what about this? The challenging part here, right, is the in their context. Because just because there's evidence that this thing works in mathematics doesn't mean it's going to work in biology, or it's going to work in computer science, or it's going to work in English, or something else. So once we have this idea of these are possible evidence-based practices, then we'll come back and talk about how do I tell if they're working for me. But how am I going to, the next thing is, how am I going to find these potentially effective practices? And so the first way to find them, well, the first one that I put on the slide is not necessarily better. One of the ways to find them is to look at the literature. So to look at what other people have published or written about this thing works for me, even if it's not quite my context. And so that's one strategy for finding them. The second one is to go to that, look at the experts at your own place. So you go to workshops that CDTL is holding, and they talk about, oh, there's this thing that you should use, and there's this thing that you should use, and should consider doing that. I guess I don't have to do that because preaching to the choir to tell you to do that, right? The third one, I'm having trouble teaching with this today, is to talk to people that are just like you in one dimension. So either people within your discipline that are teaching, and they say, oh, I got this thing that I'm trying, or maybe not within your discipline, but within, or maybe not within your, either within your discipline in, here at NUS, like your same department, or maybe in a parallel, in the same context as you at some other school. So I just met someone who teaches CS1 who's the same as me. So I'm like, oh, what do you do about this? What's your, what's your best thing that you're working on? And so, and then the last one is to talk to people in some other discipline, because sometimes that cross-pollination of you talk to someone else at the table about what they're doing, but they're in a different discipline or maybe in a different place and they've got some other ideas. So this is promised as a workshop. And so the next thing that I want you to do, if I can find, oops, oh, maybe not, let's not show that, is I was going to bring up the copy of the piece of paper that's on the table, but I've given each of you a piece of paper. And so I want you to take, actually, I think I did make a slide for it. Let me just, okay, I feel like a newbie here. 30 seconds to try to answer questions 1, 2, and 3 yourself. Yep, 30 seconds to think about which, so the question is, which strategies, really the question is number 2. So start with question number 2, and then you can go back. 30 seconds to think, 30 seconds to write, and 1 minute to share with your neighbor. So everybody has to have something written down on a piece of paper.
Why not?
So start with question 2. If you have more time, go back to question 1 and 3. We're only doing 1, 2, and 3.
I always fall people. when I wanted to go to school. I'm like, I always say, if I do work, if I do one for your tables, and I don't finish it, I don't need it for the table.
Pardon me?
Need more copies. L'heure.
Hey, I'm calling you back. All right, I forgot to bring a bell or a good technique to call you back. Who's that? Great, it's great to hear such good conversation. And in some ways I hate to break it up, but we got more to do. So I'm gonna tell you a little bit about my story. And the first story that I'm gonna tell is that I'm in the, as you said, in the teaching stream. And about 15 years ago, I didn't know very much about the literature on computing education when I was teaching it, but I didn't actually know what was there. And I decided with three other friends, we were going to meet at Starbucks at our university and read one paper and discuss it every week. And we're going to have this little reading group. And at the very beginning, we would read the papers and we would be really lost. Like back when I started, you didn't need a PhD to be in the teaching stream. I didn't have a PhD, and I got my master's, but I didn't I didn't really read a lot of papers in the disciplines that I was in. I really didn't know how to read a paper, and we just struggled through this process of doing this. And then we did it mostly during the summer, and we tried to keep it up during the year. But we kept going, and we kept starting it again every May or April when we would hand in our grades, because we would have April to August to prepare and learn and do it, because then we'd be drowning in our teaching from September to April again. And we would start it up again, and we would start it up again. We kept going. And now we've gone from the 3 of us or the 4 of us to a group of 15 to 20 people that were there last summer. And what would happen at the beginning was we would read and we would say, at first we didn't understand. And then after a little while, we were like, oh, they did this wrong and they did this wrong. We could do this better. Oh, we should do something like this. Oh, we should do. And we start eventually, after a bunch of years, we started doing some little studies in our class. And now we're to the point where our reading group often gets taken over by people giving practice talks. So the talk they're going to give about the work that they did in their class to the group, because we've progressed along that way. Now what we've settled on, the format that I would share with you if you think about doing this with teaching colleagues, is that we have a 50-minute hour at U of T, because everybody has 10 minutes to get to their next meeting. We spend the first 25 minutes talking about the research in the paper. So I don't think they did this very well. I don't understand this statistical test. Can you explain it to me? And we try to teach each other and work through the research. And then at the 25-minute mark, we say, okay, suppose the paper is true. Forget about criticizing the research, but suppose the paper is true. How does this apply to my teaching? What does this mean for our classes? How am I inspired to do something different in my teaching? And we talk about that for the next 25 minutes. And it's great. And sometimes, like, we basically give up. Sometimes it happens during the year a little bit, especially if there's somebody in town for some other reason. We get them to come give a little talk to us in our reading group. But mostly we don't try to make it work when we're buried in work, and then we start up again as soon as the break happens. And so I would encourage you to think about some kind of a little reading group specifically about the education literature that you're not ever managing to find time for. Now, my second strategy about not finding time for things is that a couple of years ago, a friend told me that she spends 30 minutes a day. She does it first. I can't do it first always, but she spends it first 30 minutes a day reading something that is not related to her actual undergraduate course teaching. And so she keeps a list of papers that somebody told me I ought to read, and then she takes one off list. And so what I do is I have them on my iPad in a folder called Reading, and I sit down in a different chair with a different device, with the iPad, not the one that has things that will interrupt me on it, and with a timer. I set 30 minutes, and I sit down and I read for 30 minutes. And when the timer goes off, I draw a line right where I am and say, start here tomorrow. And I close it up and I go back, and then I deal with all the crises of my 1,000-person class. And then I come back the next day and I open it up and I go, oh, where was I? have to read the abstract often again, and then I start reading where I was left off. I think that's 2 advantages. Really slowly, I'm learning. I'm working my way through literature. But the second advantage is that I don't get sucked down the rabbit hole. And I'm not sure if that analogy is going to work for you, but the idea being I don't get like, oh, I'm going to go look at this really interesting thing when I should be doing other work. I just put the name of the thing the person recommended on the reading list. And then I come back to it when I'm in my reading time. And it's great. It's a really good technique. I really encourage you to think about doing it. Maybe you can't do 30, maybe you can do 20. And I don't always get it. I've only done the 30 minutes a day twice since I've been here in Singapore, because I've had so much other fun stuff to do. And but I will go, I'll pick it up again. I have the reading list. It's still growing. It's waiting for me with a line drawn where I last stopped. So those are two techniques that you might consider for how to learn about the literature. So the next thing I thought we should do is talk about implementing an effective practice. And before I put you back to your worksheet, I want to teach a tiny little bit about effective practice. So suppose that you, through reading a paper or through talking to your colleagues, you have some idea about something that you want to change in your teaching. The first thing that I want to say is that you actually want to address a real, highlighters there. You can tell I haven't been, addressing a real problem. So you don't want to have a solution looking for a problem. I always wanted to try this in my class, so I'm going to do it. You want to say, in my class, my students are having trouble with this particular topic, and here's what I'm going to try to address that. So you want a real problem that you're addressing, and you really want to address one problem at a time. So don't try to say, or even only one thing to change at a time. Don't try to like, I'm going to change the world and change this and this and this. Now that said, one of the interventions I'm going to talk about was a huge change, but you probably only want to track one thing at a time. And you want to plan ahead. Lots of planning about what you're going to do. And it's specific in your planning. You should be writing down your goals. And not just your goals. So that goal shouldn't be like, my goal is to make a video about this thing. Your goal should be the learning goals for your students. I'm a little bit neater when I'm writing with real students. Okay. So if I were to just, okay, let me just like step aside to the like meta lesson and using the pre-filled slides. If I were doing this in my class, I would have distributed the slides to the students ahead of time with the gaps, probably electronically because most of them are filling it out on some kind of a device too. And then afterwards they would say, can you post the one with all the blanks filled in? And sometimes I do, and sometimes I don't. Okay, so having said this, well, let me do the thing that I would never do in my big class, which is to say, because you're a pretty sophisticated audience, which is to say, are there any questions? Anybody want to ask a question about this? I wouldn't do that in my class, right? I don't think some of you might, but you don't want to do that in your big class because, first of all, in a class of 468, there will always, every time, be someone who says, can you just repeat all that? And then you have to say no, and then it just goes bad after that. So instead, if you're asking, are there any questions to see if people are following you in a big class? That's a terrible way to know if people are following you because one student is going to represent the whole class. And so one student either will have a question or one student will say, when you ask a question and they say, oh, here's the answer. And then you're like, oh, they all get it. But actually only the one person got it. So much better. We'll try some other strategies later. But setting all that aside, since you are a sophisticated audience, does anybody have any questions that they want to talk about now? Because I'm about to send you to work on your worksheet. Yes.
Is there an ideal number for the reading group for?
Okay, so her question was, in case you couldn't hear, the ideal number for the reading group. I think, well, if you're just starting, it depends on how committed the people are. You could have a reading group with 2 if you're both ruthlessly committed to doing it, because then they don't cancel. But if you got one where people can kind of come and go as they please, then you need about 8 because on any given week, a couple people aren't gonna come. But the smaller the number, the more. If you had 3 or 4 people that said, yes, we're going to be here all the time, then that's all you need to discuss the paper. Yeah, we all read the same paper. We take turns picking what we're going to read next. We read it, we show up, you have to read it. One year, to get people to read it, you had to pay $2 if you came to the group without reading it. We put it in a bin, and then at the end of the summer, we went out for lunch. Because people would show up and they'd say, oh, I didn't really have time to read it, but I wanted to come and hear the discussion. We'd be like, okay, put your money in. And then at the end, that funded the little party. Okay, so the next thing to do, I think, oh, why is this not working? Is that questions 4, 5, 6, and 7. And this one I'm going to give you longer for because I want you to actually use this time to think about what learning outcome in your course isn't working out for you that well. Or what do you think is a current thing that you actually want to do? And it might be that your goal is just, I want to improve learning, but maybe you can be more specific. Maybe there's a topic that that students aren't getting as well. Maybe there's an issue that you want to address, and then see if you can be concrete about what exactly is the goal. What is it that you want to fix? And then how are you going to measure it? Because if you can't measure it, how are you going to know whether you improve the student learning. So what exactly are you going to measure? And how will you know if that change made any difference? And so I'm going to give you even 5 minutes to do it yourselves. And if you notice that you're really done, you don't need any more time to think about this yourself, and other people are done at your table, you could talk about it. But don't rush in order to be able to talk. This is actually a little bit of time for you to think through, what do I want to address, and what's my goal, and how will I actually know if that goal is achieved? What am I going to measure? Question on the worksheet that was actually, what change am I going to do? And I actually didn't write that down because I figured you'd all think that about it, but I didn't think yes, put that down. But because you need to think it through, but it's not the step that people usually miss. It's usually the only step that they actually get, which is that everyone says, well, I'm going to do this thing. I'm going to do this, whatever it is in my class. And then they forget about, why am I going to do it? How am I going to measure it? What's my goal for doing it, etc. So I forgot about the obvious one to put it on the sheet because I was really pushing on the other bits. But you should think through what you're going to do. Thank you for pointing that out.
Well, my yeah, so like there's a couple of things where it's helps for programming,
present my story, a couple of more stories, and then make some comments about measuring student learning and knowing if the change made a difference, and then maybe give you some more time to talk about what you think about what we just talked about. So if you've got a really burning, exciting conversation, because I'm hearing really good stuff, just like put it on, and computer science would say put it on the stack, like set it aside, and you might be able to have time to come back to that. So jot down what it was you really wanted to tell that person across the table. They're starting a reading result. Yes, okay. Okay, so I'm going to tell you 2 stories, and in both cases, we actually did a research study. We're not not computing education researchers, or we certainly weren't when we did these studies. We were just teachers or educators who wanted to try this and thought we should do it as rigorously as we could. And so I'm not saying that you should do a research study, but I am saying that I think you should not write me off because it was a research study and say, oh, forget that, that's like way out there, because I think it has elements of the kind of thing that you might want to do to evaluate teaching. And there's things for us to learn from this, even if it seems like more than what you're looking for. So the first one was about flipped classrooms. That's on the left. And just to give you a little bit of context, University of Toronto, where I work, is a large public funded research-oriented university. We have about 60,000 undergrads, which I think is double in US, having just looked at the numbers. We have about 100 faculty members in computer science, which is about the same as computing here, and 20 teaching student faculty, and we have very large undergrad classes. And in 2012, when this story starts, everybody was talking about MOOCs and about flipped classrooms and active learning. And they were saying things like, we have to use the face-to-face time in the classroom better. And so the students can just watch videos of the prof giving the lecture. And when they come to class, we'll do active learning. And it's going to be so much better. And they're making a number of claims about how it's going to be better for student learning, but also better for English language learners, because they could watch the video 2 or 3 times or turn on captioning, and better for beginners because they could practice more in class with the prof. And so there were these claims being made. And at U of T, some of my colleagues were making a MOOC, and so they were making videos. So we said, well, we can flip the class using some of these videos, but we knew ahead that we were going to do this because they were making the videos. So we knew a term ahead. So we could plan to study and collect data from the last term of the traditional offering before we made the switch. And then we could evaluate whether some of these claims were true about flipped classrooms. This picture, by the way, is because I see often the metaphor I use for my teaching with my students is that I'm the coach and they're the athlete, and there's no point in my doing any push-ups for them. So I run around my class and when we're doing worksheets like this, and if I see someone who's like on the phone or whatever, I'm like, do your push-ups, and I tell them this. And then they write on my course evaluations, she made us do our push-ups. So that's okay until your chair reads that 2 or 3 times. Michelle, what is going on in your class? Multiple students have talked about push-ups. Okay, so in this study, I worked on the Introduction to Programming course, which my new friend teaches. And it had sections of about 200 students each. And in this term, back then, the classes were small compared to now. There were 819 students in the class in 2012 and 1,000 in 2013. So this is the traditional one. In both sections, this class has about 50% beginners who've never programmed before. It's learning to program. And the remainder are students who took it probably took computing in high school, but still want to take the course because they're a little scared of skipping it. They have the option of going around it, but they decide to take it anyway, maybe for an easy mark. About 54% in both terms were students intending to take CS, because so at that time you could go on after first year and make your decision about what you wanted to take. This numerator number is the number of students who gave us consent to use their data in the study. Because we were going to test out the thing about English language learners and beginners, we had to ask other questions that you wouldn't normally have access to that data. And so we had to get research consent and then or research approval of the ethics approval and then get consent from the data. So this is how many students are actually in this data, 544 and 757. And we wanted to know, would the flipped offering have better outcomes? And by that, I mean numbers of students who stay in the course and don't drop out, numbers who pass, and actual marks of learning. Those are the outcomes we cared about. And then we also cared about their behavior and their experience. Is it horrible? Did they like it? And then we cared about this particular subgroups that we were trying to help through our program. In the data, or in the study, we had data from pre and post course surveys, and then also our standard university course evaluations the students' grades on all their work, including the final exam, and their dates of the last enrollment in the course. And what I want to point out with this, I forgot that I'm annotating the slides, I'm flipping into give a talk mode, is that this stuff, all of these bottom three, you probably have all the time. You don't need to do a research study and get a permission, etc., because you normally have access to course evaluations, grades on coursework, and data blast and all. We didn't have to do anything extra to collect that material. But because we wanted to look at some of the extra things, we also did pre and post surveys. Specifically because we knew ahead about making this change. It was a great opportunity to check out some of this stuff. So we had a number of hypotheses. The first one was that students in the inverted offering would like it better, so report higher quality of learning and greater enjoyment than the students in the traditional offering than their peers. And that was not supported. They didn't like it any better. It was the same. I mean, they weren't the same students, right? It was two different cohorts, but their numbers for saying, I liked it, I didn't like it, it wasn't supported. And it wasn't supported for beginners. We thought maybe beginners would like it because they get all this help. It was just the same. Yeah. No, so it's two different cohorts. So it's the students from 2012, right? So it's not the same student saying, I like this, I like that. It's the student saying, out of 5, how much did you like this? But it's the equivalent, right, to using your course evaluations to say, I made this a pretty improvement, it's better because the students like it, right? They didn't like it any better. That doesn't really count. Yeah. Oh, no, they all liked it because they liked the course before. So it was like, yeah, so it's not that they didn't like it. They didn't like it worse. They just gave the same 3.5 out of 5 or whatever it was. It didn't improve their enjoyment. So the score on how much they liked the course was the same. On the question, this was on our survey, not the course, because we wanted to know who they are. So the course surveys that the university runs are anonymous. We wanted to know, do the beginners think it's better? So we had to run our own surveys that could be linked to who they were, also asking how many years of experience you have, etc. Yeah, sorry.
Maybe a better approach would have been using the traditional approach for half the module and then the flipped classroom approach for the other half.
We could have. Yeah, so that would be a good way to test it if you really wanted to do that. We had like other scholarly reasons, but like it's a total buy-in to this flipped course or not. So the whole thing switched. So the leveling the playing field. So we thought for beginners that maybe the extra practice in class and the ability to rewatch the videos would help the beginners do better. And so in the flipped offering, there would be a smaller gap between the beginners and the students who came in with prior programming experience, and that was not supported. The beginners do worse than the non-beginners in both formats. Similarly, we thought that the English language learners might do better. This is what people claimed. You can slow down the video, you can watch it twice, you can turn on the captioning. So this will be good, this flipped classroom for students who have trouble with language. Not supported. The students who were English language learners for us, so this was coming from a second language, did more poorly than the fluent English speakers, regardless of the format. There was no improvement. The gap was the same. Completion rates. We said the pass rate's going to be higher than the flipped offering than in the traditional offering. And there's lots of ways you can measure pass rate, because it mostly depends on the denominator. Who do you count as ever having been in the course? And you know how many people passed, but out of how many? What day? You probably all, if you teach, you know that the enrollment in the course changes, like it's a moving thing. Anyway, no matter how we calculate it, we said it's the first day, it's the peak day, it's the drop day, it's the last day, whatever it was, the pass rates were remarkably the same between the two offerings. And if we only looked at the beginners, the pass rates were the same between the two. So far we're not winning here. Then we compared learning. So to gauge learning, we wanted to compare final exam grades, right? To see, because that's something that's supervised. We know they're not cheating, etc. But we can't use the same exam one term to the next, because our exams go into a repository in the library and every student has access to them. We try very hard to set comparable exams every year, but unlike you, which I hear you get like your exams I don't know, approved or calibrated. Somebody else looks at them. Nobody checks out our exams to decide if they're good or not. So what we did was we tried to make 2 exams that were comparable. We tried to make an exam in the second year that was comparable to the first year. Then we separated all the questions, mixed them all up, and gave them to 2 evaluators that didn't know which questions came from which exams, and they marked how difficult each question was, etc. Then we reassembled them to compare. One evaluator had them almost exactly the same, and the other one had the flipped exam as harder. So we concluded that the flipped exam was not easier. And then we looked at the final grade. And we hypothesized that the exam grades would go up because of the active learning in class. And it was supported, so I need my notes to get the exact number. So the traditional class had 66.2 as their average on the exam. And the flipped offering had 74.3. So 8.1% increase when we actually measured learning. So they didn't like it any better. They didn't, it didn't help the beginners, it didn't help the ELL learners, but it helped everybody on average 8% on what we thought was at least an equivalent, if not harder, exam. So there's a couple of reasons for this. Maybe they learned more due to the active learning. That's what we hoped. Or maybe though, they learned more in the flipped offering because they spent more time. They were watching these videos at home and then they were coming to class when they would have come to class. But on the actual surveys, the students did not report spending more time. So we asked how many hours a week were you spending on this course both years, and it was the same. Maybe they did better because more beginners dropped out. So maybe by the time we got to the end, it was the stronger students who were left, so those are the ones writing the exam. But the drop rates among the beginners were not significantly different across offerings. So the same percentage of beginners were left. So we're left thinking that they actually learn more because they had more active learning. Yeah.
Can you tell us more about the time with the instructor? Like what were you doing? How many students?
Yeah, sure. I will show you a picture. If I can figure it out. That is my class. That is my 468 person class. And see, they're sitting at these little tables. And this is before class, if you haven't come in yet, I went up to take a picture. So what we do in class mostly is some kind of activity that reinforces what they watched on the videos. So in the videos beforehand, we teach the material just straight up. This is what an array is, this is what a variable is, and they're well-made videos. They're not sort of sloppy, just a recording of someone's lecture. They're very carefully made. They were made for a MOOC, and they're really loved, and they've been remade and improved, etc. Then when they come to class, they get a worksheet that's much nicer than the worksheets I gave you, that often has them trace through some scaffolded exercise where they're doing questions, and they're encouraged to work in groups on it. And I run up and down the stairs, and I see that like the 3 or 4 groups are having the same problem. I fix it at 2 groups, and the third time it happens, I turn my mic on and come bounding down from the top and say, okay, let's all talk about question 3. I see that people are struggling with this thing. We still meet with them for 3 hours a week, which is what this course used to have. 3 hours of lecture. Now we do 3 hours of this kind of practice. They don't have to hand in the worksheets. They're not marked. There's no attendance marks, but most students, well, it varies. Some students don't come to class because they say I learned from the videos, and I say that's fine. Because if they're learning and they don't need to come to class, that's more of me to go around with them. So by the middle of the class, I only have 200 showing up in that room, which is just fine. And I get about 4 TAs to come and also walk around. We stop periodically and do mini lectures on things that we've probably already covered in the video, but everyone's struggling with it. I take out worksheets on my iPad. And do little bits of it, but it's a lot of working on the fly to see how you're doing. Now I know exactly where they're going to struggle, and we tweak the worksheets, but we pretty much fine-tune them. And you don't want to take all the struggle out of it, because part of the struggle is about, like, I can't see this and now I get it, and so we work with them to do the material. Okay, I'm going to go on because this really isn't about the flipped classroom. Although the result is that we've gone on to, I flipped another one of my courses, even though it took hundreds of hours out of my life to make the video, because it was such a good thing for my students. And then now what I've done more recently is I've gone with short readings on Canvas and questions on Canvas before class. So I don't teach all the material for a week. I teach the easy bits. So if we're going to do a topic and there's some really easy introductory stuff, I teach that and then have little quizzes about that. And when they come to class, I just start at the crunchy bits, and I use all the lecture time to teach, but then do exercises, teach worksheet in the class for the hard bits of the material, because the easy bits they got ahead of time. But I don't have to make 100-hour expensive videos to I can write out the little lessons. And I found that that's a good compromise. Maybe the videos would be better, maybe they learn more, maybe I could do that. But there's a compromise right in your life about how much time you have to prep materials. Anyway, yeah, sure.
Did you keep track of the
So they're posted on a university site, but they're also posted on YouTube, and so I can look at the analytics of how many have watched them and stuff. For the first year CS course, I'm not in I'm not in hardly any of the videos, because I wasn't the maker of the videos. I was involved in the study and I teach it, but I wasn't in them. For my videos for the second year course, which were made in 2015, I can tell you there's 10,000 watches of this one, and I can see which part of the video they're spending all the time on, which means that's the part I know I probably should do in class a little more.
Still getting the choice number one, you assume that's the case. But it could be doing something else. Now let's just use it for what it could be doing something else.
It could still be doing something else. Okay, so coming back here. Let's not talk about that. We do question. Okay, so the second intervention is exam wrappers. In an exam wrapper, I had a prop, but I'm not going to dig it out right now. The idea with an exam wrapper, go to the next slide, is that the student writes the test, that's this piece here. And then when you go to give it back, you wrap around it another piece of paper. That's why it's called an exam wrapper, or you staple it to the front, that has questions on it. Questions about their performance on the exam. My first question there, I know you're not supposed to be able to read this font. I can actually read it from here. And it says, go through here and mark how many marks you lost on that test on each of these topics. They have to look through their test and say, oh, I lost 3 marks on this topic and 4 marks on this topic. And the idea is to get them to look at their test. And then you ask questions about, the next question was like, how many minutes and what percentage of your study time did you spend studying by writing or typing summaries, asking questions during office hours, all the different ways that you could have invested in studying. And you're trying to get to develop their metacognition skills on thinking about being better students by reflecting on how they did on this test and how they prepared for this test. And then you might also have missed content. So if they did really badly on a certain question, you might give them a wrapper that has stuff about that question on it. Then the students fill this out, and then they turn it in, and you grade it. So there's some motivation to do it, because they're going to get like a tiny little mark for it. And then you give it back to them just before they write the next test. So they're reminded about what they did last time, and maybe I should do a better job studying. So this was all the rage, right? Oh, exam wrappers, they're going to make a big difference. There's articles about it, etc. But we decided that we would try it. So I tried it in my second year systems programming class, and students picked up their tests really promptly, and most of them did the wrapper, but it was a lot of work to make the wrapper in the first place, and then to staple them all to the tests. We had 4 different wrappers with different kinds of questions depending on what they did wrong on their tests. So we had to look at how the students did and staple the right color of wrapper on it. And then we had to collect them all again, and then we had to mark them all again, and then we had to return them and record the scores, all for this like tiny little percentage. And so my question was it worth it? I mean, there's a lot of things I could spend my time doing as an instructor to try to improve my students. Is this the thing I should spend my time on? So we decided to do a scholarly evaluation of this. And so I'll dissect this slide a little bit, but we divided our students into 3 groups, random assignment. And when we gave back their test, stapled to it were the questions about where did you lose marks, look through the test. But then to fill that in, they had to go to a website to put the answers in for the question. They got the question on the thing, and the token that got them to the website put them into one of 3 groups. And so this group got extra content questions. We knew which questions students struggled with on the test. We made an extra question about them for them to practice that concept. And so that group got content question. This group got a metacognition question, a whole bunch about studying. So extra questions about all those questions that were the second part about how did you study and was that effective and what are you going to change next time what you're studying, that kind of question. And then this last group got placebo questions. And I don't know where my research colleague got the questions from. They were things like, how much do you like your, and we were, that kind of thing. But I was really nervous because like you have to be careful you don't actually do something effective with those questions. It's hard to pick good placebo questions, and we're not psychologists, so we didn't even know really what we were doing, but he was convinced these were the best questions we could. So everybody, all the groups picked up the tests with equal high pickup rates. Of course, like they're just randomly assigned to a group and they don't even know. But the time that they spent doing this thing, the metacognition people spent more time than the placebo. So obviously I didn't do the design of placebo well enough because it should have been the same amount of time to do it. And the content people spent way more time than the metacognition people. But the exam performance on the overall in the exam and on the question that was about that content area was the same. No effect. Right, so maybe we're done, but there's another reason why it could be the same, right? Maybe it really does work. Like maybe the thing that works is the look over your test and tell me where you lost the marks, because that at least makes them pick up the test and look at it. So if this is the important part of an exam wrapper that all those people are talking about at CDTL type places, then I haven't tested that because all of the students got that. So what do? Another experiment. In fact, 2 more. So this one was at U of T. We got ethics permission to do this because now this is a bit trickier because we're believing that maybe these guys are going to benefit now. Because when I wrote the proposal for the first one, I said, I believe that the effect is the first thing and these other things aren't going to matter, and so they gave you permission. And I was surprised we got permission to do this, but we did. And so one half of the class got review the paper and metacognition, and the other half got lots more placebo. And basically not, and it was with the teeny thing. So again, this time when you picked up your test, it just had the token on it. It just said, go to this website for your exam wrapper. Because so that nobody got, other times it had these questions on it. So when you got there, then it said what you had to do. So it was random assignment. And what we found, and then this test, this was a colleague at another university who was super excited about what we'd done before and really believed in exam wrappers. Like really believed it. And at his university, the final exams are private and they can use them over and over again. And so he had taught the course with no wrapper. So he taught the course, tried to keep it just the same, gave the whole shebang to everybody in the class, and then gave them the same final exam. And he believed in it. He talked about the wrapper in class. He used all the best practices trying to make this work. You can guess what happened, right? No effect in either class. Pickup rates were better for this, but no learning gains. Now, there's a lot of problems. Like if you're going to be, that might be enough for me as the teacher, but as the researcher, that's not good enough. There's a whole lot of threats to validity in these studies, right? In the first study, we didn't follow the best practices for wrappers because we're in class and half the students aren't getting it, so we can't talk about it. We can't talk about the metacognition and debrief like most of you checked this, and so we can't follow any of those best practices because it would pollute this group. And all the participants were incentivized to pick up the test because we had to give the 1% to anybody, even the placebo guys who did their wrapper, even though it only had placebo questions on it. So everybody was incentivized to pick up the test. So that, maybe the effect is because you picked up your test. Because lots of students didn't used to even come back and get them. And then there's problems with this one too. This one wasn't random assignment. It's not a random control trial because it's a pseudo experiment because the students in this year's fall class might be quite a bit different than the students in this year's fall class. They change every year in computer sciences. The world changes. And the classroom experience was not identical. Now, he tried really hard to do the same things with the same structure, but it's not identical. Things are different. Maybe the students had other deadlines. But our argument was, we put these papers together actually, that when you look at them together, this one has random assignment, this one doesn't. This one has the classroom experience identical because it's the same class, but it doesn't have the best practices and they're all picking up the tests. And this one was not random assignment, but he followed all the best practices. And so the fact that neither of them worked out, that we couldn't show effect in either, was enough for me as a teacher to say, you know, maybe exam wrappers, this is the bottom line, maybe exam wrappers aren't that worth our time. You think they should work, right? They sounded great. The midterm pickup rate went way up and students really liked them. That was the other thing, we surveyed the students. And so if you are basing the success of your intervention on if students liked it, and if they picked up their tests, as this, if your evidence for what you're going to measure was whether they picked up their thing, then, but the final exam grades didn't change. And I didn't tell you before, but the pass-fail drop distribution didn't change in any of the 3 cases either. Because one of the things we care about a lot in computer science is who drops out partway through, not just how their grades work, who doesn't make it. None of those change. So the final conclusion is, if you want to improve learning, you should measure learning. Yeah.
So let's say this is zero cost, this improvement, right? And learning did not happen as good. So would it be worth it in that?
That's a great question. So sometimes I'm going to tell you, I won't tell you the whole story of another study, but we did another study that was about putting computer science questions in a context. So we have a tendency to ask questions like, let me put it in a math context. 5 + 4 = what? And then if you want to put it in context, you'd say, if you have 5 students and you add 4 students to them, how many do you have? So we did this study on whether we should embed the computer science concepts that we wanted to teach in some kind of real world context, and would that help the students learn better? And there were no learning gains, but there was motivation gain, and there was happiness gain, and also people felt like you could teach some of your other less computer sciencey learning goals. You could give the Renaissance man education, and so we also showed that there were no learning losses by putting these problems in context. And so if there's nothing to be lost, then sometimes you might make a change that isn't going to improve the direct learning. But my argument is that you need to test it to know whether you're hurting or helping, and then make your decisions, because our time is limited. And it's not just our time is limited, our students' time is limited. You can probably improve learning if you can get the students to spend all of their available hours on your course and ignore all their other courses. But that's not going to improve their whole learning as a human being and as a student. So you need to measure how effective your interventions are and think carefully about where the trade-offs are and what you should invest your time in and what you should ask the students to invest their time in. Okay. So that's the end of that story. Okay, and I can't advance. There we go. So I want to go back to the worksheet again and just give you a minute, now that I've inspired, cajoled, yelled at, whatever, for you to think about and you've already written something down. Go back and see if you would change how would I measure student learning for the thing that I'm thinking about changing. And if you don't have any changes to make at all, you can carry on your little discussions that you're having at the table. But talk about the last two. How will you measure student learning, and how will you know if your change made any difference in light of a little more time to have thought about it? I wanted to just point out one thing about how you know if your change made any difference. There's sort of 2 things you might think about there. One is year over year, and then in which case you have to think about what. But you also might do pre-post within a year. Maybe you're seeing, I did this thing. It's not a change, but my intervention, and you learned something. Okay, so this slide is about stepping up the rigor of what you're doing. And I want to start with a caveat, which is that scholarly reflection and scholarly integrity comes before rigor. Now that seems weird. It sounds like I'm saying it's okay to not be rigorous. But as a teacher, your primary goal is the learning of your students. And so sometimes, like I'm encouraging you to, do this a little more formally, make this more of a study, et cetera. And I'm going to talk about some things that you could, like ways to do it a little bit more rigorously. But you can't compromise your teaching, and lots of times you're constrained by, like I just had to help this student, it's going to wreck my study, and I'm going to take them out. But like the student comes first, and so in any of these things, the student comes before that, and we'll come back to the scholarly way to do it. But having said that, one of the things that you might, one of the things I was harking on before was you have to plan ahead. And if you're going to do some sort of educational study, plan ahead for what you're going to collect, but also how am I going to analyze it? And I would encourage you even to pre-register your study. And I didn't even know what that meant 10 years ago. Maybe it didn't exist. I don't know. It was only a few years ago that people started talking about pre-registration. And so just in case you're in that situation where I was a couple of years ago, what it means is that you decide ahead of time, I'm going to collect this data, I'm going to run this test, I'm going to have this hypothesis, and this is what I'm going to do with the outliers, and then this is who I'm going to drop if they don't complete the questions. You make the decision, you even maybe write the code that you're going to, in my case, that you're going to run on the data, and then you go to a website and you register that all. And nobody can see it if you make it private. There's all kinds of variations, but we do the simplest, easiest thing. But it forces you to be honest in your evaluation instead of picking at, like hypothesizing after you've seen the results. It also forces you not to like play with, oh, well, if I didn't include the students who dropped till after the second week, then my result will be statistically significant. None of that stuff, because you committed to this is how I'm going to do the study. And so it's my current hobby horse that I'm on the bandwagon of pre-register your stuff and I get my students, my undergraduate students are helping me with things to pre-register because it's a good experience for them to have to figure out what we're going to do. You might need ethical review for a study because in my institution, I don't need any ethical review if I'm collecting data and analyzing my course data to improve my course. But if I want to publish that later at some kind of conference, or I want to collect data that I wouldn't normally have in the course of teaching in the activity of teaching a course, then I would have to go through the ethics. And it's not so hard. It's really not hard. At least in my institution, it's a little bit of work. You have to do all the things that you had to do here, plan the study, and tell them this is what I'm doing. But this is what tests I'm going to run. This is what I'm going to collect. And then when you get around to doing it, it's really easy because you already worked it all out. Involve an unbiased colleague. So if you're analyzing your course, get your friend who's doesn't have something at stake for whether this worked or not. Get them to look at the data you collected and give you an opinion. Perhaps involve an undergraduate student. So we have to work with students separately as individual projects for the fourth year. And often they come and say, oh, can I work on some project with you? And I say, oh, I have a computing education little side project that I'm analyzing. I can't give them data with people's names in it. I have to anonymize the data, and there's some caveats to working with students. But partly I get them to pre-register because often in the time frame of their project, we can't do both design it and run it. So they can design it and register it, and then some other student can come along another term. Get data from your pre-intervention if you can, so that you can compare, and work with your colleagues so that you have more than just you trying to get this thing done. Having said that, now I want to step back to, okay, it's not a study, it's just what I'm doing with my teaching. And so the primary audience for what you're doing in terms of evaluating your teaching is you. Like you're doing this for you so that you can improve your teaching. And so one of the things though that comes out of that is people say, oh, well then I don't have to take it so seriously, I don't need to pre-register it. I mean, I'm just the only one looking at it, no one will ever see it. But I think you should still force yourself to write down your reflections. And keep your data. Then if you decide, oh, well, I'm never going to teach this course again. I don't need these data. I don't need these reflections. And then a couple of years later, you're assigned that course and you say, oh, I'm going to do it this way now. Now you got the data from the pre-intervention because you kept it, thinking that maybe someday I would be comparing to it. And you forced yourself to write down because you think you'll never forget what went wrong in this course or what went right. And by the time you teach 4 other courses, you can't remember what you were going to fix about whatever it was. Like, write down your reflections. Take the time to reflect, not just on the student feedback, but on the numbers you've collected, and write down your stuff. And then change one. You're going to teach it again. I left myself some more room so I could put 4 at most 2 things. So if you're going to know if a certain thing is effective, don't change like 17 things in the course, or you won't know what had an effect and what didn't and what really worked. Or maybe you will, you'll have a sense of what was contributing and not contributing. But I guess what I'm saying with this one is don't overreach to the point where you can't do anything well because you're just barely doing it. Which is sometimes the way I feel when I'm trying to teach my class, right? You can't get so many things on the go. So the cycle that I'm presenting to you is this. I teach my class, then I collect data on student learning. Then after I've collected that data, I reflect on my teaching in light of the data. And then after I've reflected, I change my teaching based on the reflection. Maybe that happens in a little tiny loop. Like I teach today's class, and then I had them do a question on poll everywhere, and then I looked at how they did, then I make a change for tomorrow's class. Or maybe it happens in a big loop where I teach a whole unit of my module, and then I have a little test, and then they didn't do so well on it, and then I change it. And maybe next year I change what I did because I saw, and then the thing is, you go around again, you change your teaching, and then, oh, I get assigned to teach this course again, or another course that's sort of related, and now I've implemented some change, and now I collect data again. Oh, now I can show you the cool laser pen there. Now I collect data again, and I come down here, and I reflect on that new data, and I make some more little changes to my class. And then the whole thing is influenced by this reading about best practices. So the reading about best practices maybe gave me input in the first place into what to do, or maybe not. Maybe I just did what I inherited from the previous person who taught the course. But then, once I was reflecting on my teaching in light of the data, I'm also incorporating what I learned from my reading about best practices. So I'm looking at what happened in light of what I read, and that's inspiring me to make some changes. And then when I make those changes, I teach again with the new changes, and I collect data again. And I get better and better at being a teacher or an educator because I've gone through this scholarly cycle. Okay, at risk of doing this again, does anyone want to ask any questions about that?
Can you repeat all of that?
After class. If you'd like, I have office hours on Tuesday. Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah.
So they any system available out there? Because they're not working, kind of data.
So you want to follow them around and record them? I think that's a bad idea.
You know what I'm talking about. Because I think when you try to understand what they do, you don't follow them. In the literal, not in the literal sense. How do you know it's
Right. Yeah. So that's a very hard question, which is how much to monitor their learning as they're going to, and the more you do, the finer grain granularity you have on how they're doing, but the bigger this data is, right? Oh, sorry, I wanted to circle that. If you have a huge amount of data because you collected all kinds of stuff all the time, and at some point you can't look at it all, right? So sometimes there's some systems where we can look at how students do on a set of questions, but yeah, that trade-off of too much granularity, maybe, and sometimes you collect all kinds of stuff and you just look, the whole class is, like the class averages on different things, the whole class is struggling with this question. And I'm not worried about, it's not I'm not worried about an individual student, but I'm looking at the big trends of, I can see that almost everybody got this question wrong, and so that's where I'm going to change my focus for the next class if I'm in a small group, or the next year if I'm in a big group. Okay, so this is not the step. So once you've done this, once you put in the effort to do the scholarly cycle for yourself, if you do it in a rigorous way, and even if it's not, if you do it in a scholarly way, then there's often times where you want to present that and share it with other people. Like at the beginning, we said, how did you learn about best practices? Well, maybe you learned about them from some other people at your table, or from a CDTL workshop, or from other people in your community. And so I think it's important to not just like live in your own little bubble and make your course better and better and better and not share that out. And so there's a lot of options for the ways you could do that. You could tell your reading group that you formed about it, and do a little, presentation talk at your reading group, or present it to your immediate community, what I usually call my tribe, which is the people in my reading group. Or you maybe could submit it to some local teaching and learning event. I don't even know what you have here, but we have these little, once a year, there's a call for submissions for some creative teaching and learning thing that people are doing around the university. And you could, if depending on how carefully you do this and track the data, you can present something to say, look, I did this and we did this, and there's what the change was. And if you have something to say because you kept the data, then you have more than just, I made this change and I liked it, because that's not that rigorous. Maybe if you step it up a notch, you can even submit it to a discipline-specific education venue. So in my case, there's 4 conferences globally, at least, that are now about computer science education. So like millions of computer science technical conferences, but there's some that are just about education, and they're exactly people who want to know about studies of learning and what we did. And sometimes what you do is a research study, like those ones I presented were both presented at a conference on computer science education research. But they also, in my discipline at least, and possibly in yours, there's this opportunity to write shorter papers that are experience reports. And rather than being evaluated on the research, they're evaluated on their value to other educators for telling them about what you did and that experience. And so the kind of questions in the review for those papers are about, did they give enough details that you could adopt this in your class or evaluate it? Did they give enough explanation about the context so that you could decide if it applies to another context? Have they done enough? So I can't remember exactly the questions, but they're not expecting for those track of papers for you to have p-values and statistical tests, but they're expecting sort of lessons from the trenches about what could go wrong when you do this. And when I did this thing in my class, here's the things that almost tanked me, and here's how we recovered, and like real dirt on how to do this thing in your class. And those are great papers to read, and they're a good place to publish if you've done some interesting thing in your class. And you still have to have collected enough data and tracked it enough to be able to explain it to somebody else and justify it. If you do that, if you submit to either one of these things, something that you wrote up, even if you think it's like not going to be good enough, the review can be really valuable to help you see what else you could have considered. The person, oh, you might consider doing this, might consider doing that. Another one of my bandwagons that I'm on, if you submit something and you're asking for the reviewing community to review it in these sorts of papers, maybe the first time you get a free pass, but the second time you should be volunteering as a reviewer. So that you're also, and that also is a really valuable experience because it forces you to think carefully about scholarly work. Okay, so just a couple more things and we're almost over at 5 minutes. So the takeaway, not every teaching innovation is worth doing. You can't do them all. There just isn't time. And so you need to think about, are you sure what you're doing is working? And one way to answer that question is to systematically evaluate your efforts in a rigorous way. Evaluate what you really care about, which is probably student learning. And so on this arrow, I think, well, some of you aren't teachers at all, but most people that I'm talking to, we teach our classes. And most of us reflect on our teaching. Say, oh, that went pretty well, that didn't do pretty good. I'm never doing that again. And some of us, probably everybody, changes their teaching based on their reflection. But this is different. This is evaluating my teaching in a scholarly way. This is reflecting, but not just my opinion, like I thought it was okay, or my students liked it and I got good course evals, but actually evaluating it, thinking about what can I measure, how can I know if this works, which is what I was trying to get you to work on and what you keep thinking about later. And so evaluating in a scholarly way, and then changing your teaching. So each time we would change our teaching based on reflection and go back and teach our class again. But now I want to push you over here to do it in a little more rigorous way. And if you're already here, if you're already evaluating your teaching in a scholarly way and collecting that stuff, then I want to push you a little over here to say, like, let's up our game a bit. If you're already collecting data on your class, and then think about, like, what would I have to do this in a slightly more rigorous way so that I could publish it somewhere and actually make it a research study. And all of that is grounded in reading about the best practices and the research and education in your discipline. So discipline-based education research. And then the cool part is once you do this, then you start to contribute to that. But if you're only here, like I saw a couple people when we did our very first thing had less than a year as their teaching. It's okay to just teach your class right now, but at least reflect on what you're doing and update. And actually, since you're already here, you should really start collecting the data so that soon you can move to this one. So wherever you are on this arrow, your goal is to move a little bit more to the right, add a little more rigor or scholarly approach to what you're doing. And then ultimately, hopefully maybe you never want to do this, and that would be okay. But I want to talk about why you might want to do this in my last 2 minutes, which is the objection of, I have no time for this. I can't do research. My research colleagues, they have lots of time because they don't get a big teaching load, right? So how can we possibly do this? So my thing is, think really small. Absolutely only do it in the context of your teaching, because that's what you're mostly doing, right? I'm assuming most of you are teaching mostly. And so in the context of your teaching, go that extra little bit to do the research and use it as a training ground for students so that you're teaching them as their project. And half of them won't work out. Like in the end, it won't, but it'll still have been worthwhile because you've worked with those students. And then work together with other people to spread the load over. And think small to think, like, it takes us a long time. Like, I only get one, well, like a paper that my research colleague would churn out in, I don't know, a week or whatever. It takes me a year because I can only work on it I can only read papers for half an hour every morning. I have no money for this. My research colleagues have big grants and I have no grants. So how can I possibly do this? Right? Well, the progress is slower. You can have virtual meetings. Lots of things are free software to do things. You can get undergrads to volunteer, and you can do the data analysis yourself. You're not hiring a statistician or whatever. It just takes a long time, and you work together and you spread it out. So if you do have to pay students some, I don't know, we did some surveys where we had to pay people for interviews or something. We split it between a bunch of us, so it doesn't have to be super expensive. Why should I do this? So I maintained that it will make your teaching better. And that will make your department better. And that may even improve your relationships with your research colleagues in your department who totally get research and don't quite get some of the other things we do. But my main reason for doing it is not any of those. It's because it's fun. I think it's fun to think about what's not working in my teaching. What's the question I want to ask? I think it's fun to work out how am I going to try to make that better. It's fun to work out what is actually, how can I do a study that could get at that? So that I'm thinking about those exam wrappers, if I do this, then that would be wrong. And if I do this, then that would be wrong. What can I do in the constraints of a real class with real students who I have to look after and teach? And it's fun to work with my colleagues. So on that note, I thought I should put their pictures up. So these are all the people that were involved in this studies that you saw or that influenced my thoughts. These three are people here at NUS that are here with me on the external review panel who have influenced a bunch of what I added into this. And then, because we've been talking about feedback and improving, I have a URL here that has a form. There's lots of ways we could do feedback. We're over, so I'm not going to talk about, we could do minute papers or a poll question, but I decided to give you an online form or a survey where I would love if you would give me some feedback about what you did or didn't learn. You'll notice it's maybe a little different once you go there than a lot of surveys. It doesn't give you like, please rate this person out of 5. It says things like, please finish these sentences in a sentence. Things like the thing that I wish you wouldn't have talked about is this. So thank you very much.